going, guys? Welcome back to my channel and time for another combo review, and this one is extra spooky. Side note, since when have studios almost become afraid of releasing horror films at Halloween? Because I could probably make a good guess and say that the pair of these films will have likely made a very strong dent in the box office around Halloween time, and yet they're out in April. Why? Anyway, went slightly off track there. Yes, two new horror films at your service, and later on I'll be giving you my thoughts on the two Nicks in Renfield. However, first up, we better find a confessional and say our Hail Marys, because there is some demonic work afoot in The Pope's Exorcist.
Father Gabriele Amort. On the night of June 4th, you performed an exorcism.
That was not an exorcism.
Set in the 80s and based on real writings, Russell Crowe plays Father Gabriel Amort, the chief exorcist of the Vatican. He very rarely comes across any legitimate evil, and mostly deals with severe cases of delusion or psychosis. However, when called to help a young boy and his family, all the signs begin to point towards genuine possession, and an extremely dangerous demon being the cause. Exorcism films of late have been very lackluster. Often studios simply see them as a way to possibly do some creepy stuff on camera, half-arse a story, and for some reason audiences will probably turn up. And truth be told, that is exactly what I was expecting with The Pope's Exorcist. A guided tour through every single cliche of a possession movie. It probably wasn't going to be all that scary, and Russell Crowe was just going to kind of show up on set, say whatever line has been written for him, and take home a very nice and juicy paycheck. And as it turns out, The Pope's Exorcist, it isn't scary, and it does pretty much check off every single possession movie cliche in the book. But this was far more entertaining than it had any right to be, and that is predominantly to do with Russell Crowe giving, and unexpectedly, but I'm very thankful for it, quite the committed performance. Now, there are some undeniably silly moments in this film. There are often sequences of Crowe zipping about on his Vespa, I think it's a Lambretta, as he's cuckooing at passing sisters like the bad boy priest he is. And whilst the shenanigans around him could have fallen very flat, Crowe actually makes a performance out of this and really creates this character for you to go on this adventure with. And in turn, I couldn't help but enjoying it. It's not bad, guys. I do want to stress, though, that this story is wafer thin, and it suffers with some severe exposition dumps that not even Father Gabriel Amort himself could exercise from the film. But director Julius Avery helms it all with a knowing wink as to how preposterous much of this is, and by the time we get to a third act, kind of pitches a Hail Mary and opts to go hell for leather in a finale that went pretty freaking hard. There's admirable production behind this too. Stunts, production design, visual effects. This isn't a cheap exorcism movie, and I appreciate that. That being said, this movie does seem to jump from about a 30 to 230 in the space of maybe a scene, but I kind of dug it, because you end up pairing that with somewhat of a buddy priest mystery, as it's almost like a really weird episode of Scooby-Doo, as Father Gabriel Amort and a local Spanish priest are uncovering a larger conspiracy to do with the Vatican itself that, I won't lie, was actually quite intriguing. It's entirely nonsensical, but you merge all of this together, and The Pope's Exorcist actually wound up being one of the more pleasant surprises of 2023. Don't get me wrong, I would hesitate to call this a great movie, because besides Crow, no one else's performance really stands out, and therefore the characters are entirely forgettable. As I mentioned before, it really is not scary in the slightest, and I can't say that I'm, like, avidly wanting to watch this again in the near future, but for all its stupidity and goofiness, The Pope's Exorcist was not the catastrophe I was expecting going in. It does adhere to the exorcism movie formula, faults and all, and barely raises your pulse beyond its resting rate. But nevertheless, all it asks you to do is hop on board its Vespa and come along for a loud, energetic, and reasonably entertaining ride, complete with plenty of demonic violence and a dedicated Russell Crowe leading the way. It is far from perfect, but you could do a hell of a lot worse. I'm going to give The Pope's Exorcist a 6.5 out of 10. I was thinking about giving like a 6.66, but that would be tacky. And if there is one thing this channel is not, no, it can be pretty tacky. Now we jump from demonic possessions to a blood-sucking vampire, as the iconic story of Dracula is about to be retold, just not in the way we're used to, in Renfield.
My boss, he's different.
You can't get him out of your head.
No.
I need your assistance.
I'm coming, Master! Oh, you feel like he could destroy you with the snap of his fingers.
Wouldn't even need to snap.
Okay.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, what?
Robert Montague Renfield is what's known in the vampire world as a familiar. It's a servant-like role designed to cater to the whims and needs of whomever be their vampiric master. In Renfield's case, his master is the one and only Count Dracula. After realizing that he is stuck in a toxic, codependent relationship, Renfield does what he can to escape Dracula's control and start a new life, even if it means running into the local criminal underworld. Contrary to The Pope's Exorcist, I actually thought that this looked quite promising. It had a very unique perspective on a centuries-old tale, and the idea of a comedic look at Dracula and his manservant getting on in modern day had me very interested to see what they had in store. Not to mention, they went and cast Nicolas Cage as Dracula, a role that he himself has said he was somewhat born to play. Seriously, it has to go down as one of the most inspired pieces of casting ever. It's a shame, however, then, just like The Pope's Exorcist, funnily enough, that my expectations were somewhat flipped. I went from having lots of faith as to what this movie had to offer to losing it very quickly as I soon began to realize what this movie actually is. It's not a horror comedy. In fact, there's little horror about it. This is an action movie. This is an action comedy. Just so happens to feature iconic horror characters. And it's another very good action comedy. It's your run-of-the-mill, unremarkable action comedy that kind of left me more and more disinterested the longer it went on. The plot itself is weak to say the least. The plot thread that I was most interested in was the relationship between Dracula and Renfield, and even that began to lose some steam after a while. But the film also decides to unnecessarily focus a lot of its screen time on Awkwafina's character's search for justice and vengeance among the New Orleans Police Department and criminal underworld. Can you see what I'm saying about the wrong story choices clearly being made here? As for performances, look, even in the most dire of circumstances, and I want to preface, Renfield is by no means a horrendous film, it's just not very good, but in those dire circumstances, Nicholas Hoult is very dependable as a lead hero, and the same goes for here. He does all that's required of him, the comedy, the action, and he's actually got a very likeable and charming screen presence about him. It's just that Hoult needs a really good movie to be able to properly show this off. As for Nicolas Cage, though, this is when Renfield is at its best. He chews the scenery and sucks everything he can from this role, going full Cage at some points, which is more than okay, but he rocks it. Also, I really do have to commend the brilliant work of the practical makeup team for this film, some of the designs that they have for Dracula are freaking gnarly. Awkwafina was fine, her usual comedy shtick was toned down, and then we turn our attention to Ben Schwartz, who was so over the top in the film that his entire storyline about the mob, which I already wasn't invested in, but that entire storyline really grated on me. Speaking of over the top, let's talk about the violence. Oh my god, this is a very violent movie. The level of violence and gore in Renfield borders on a level so extreme. I was so shocked to see this is rated as a 15. Then again, the violence is of a very cartoonish nature. I mean, for crying out loud, characters don't even get covered in blood. And believe me, there are sequences where there are fountains of blood gushing out of people, and not a drop of it falls on the characters. I don't mind ridiculous levels of violence, but for me, this did cross a line into just being quite juvenile. And that brings me on to my final point to do with Renfield, and that is that its target audience, I would estimate, would be around 13 to 14 years of age, and they can't see the movie. I was quite disappointed with Renfield. On paper, there seemed to be the potential to wring a lot of humour from the concept, but alas, the writers and director Chris McKay disappointingly opted for a bog-standard action comedy that coasts along as a dull spark until someone's head comes flying off its body. If you are desperate to see it, my strongest recommendation is purely because of Nick Cage as Dracula. As for pretty much everything else, feel free to let this one come and go from cinemas without making a great deal of noise. I'm going to give Renfield a 4 out of 10. Anyway guys, those were my thoughts on The Pope's Exorcist and Renfield. Let me know, have you had a chance to see either of these films yet? What did you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. But that's all we have time for here today, so thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Hello, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have, make sure to click that like button, and if you aren't already, click that subscribe button too.